We use stories to explain the world and how we as people fit into it. The stories we tell ourselves and each other influence the way we see the world in all its complexity. When it comes to groups or individuals experiencing poverty or disadvantage, what gets told, what gets repeated, and what gets left out is critical in forming our attitudes towards those groups. We call these stories public narratives, the way TV, the papers, radio and social media portray disadvantage. Researchers from Behaviour Works Australia have released the first known heat map of how a range of groups experiencing disadvantage are represented in Australian public narratives.
There are a lot of researchers around the world who examine how the media portrays disadvantaged groups. So what we did in this review was we found 35 studies that focused on media portrayals of disadvantage in Australia. The heat map represents the findings of those 35 studies in a simplified grid.
The top 3 ways these groups are represented are through negative stereotypes, misrepresentation, or absence.
So another way of thinking about negative stereotypes is what we called a deficit narrative. A deficit narrative is when you focus on a negative characteristic of the group, which then becomes known as a defining feature of that group. So common example is younger people or Gen Z, lazy, self-entitled, need everything done for them. And that's an example of a deficit narrative because it's really only talking about one characteristic. There are plenty of young people who are very independent, very selfless, do things for others. Misrepresentation is basically when you describe a group, but you omit key characteristics of that group, or you emphasise only one characteristic. Describing older people in terms of the ailments that they have doesn't really represent the fact that many older people don't experience those ailments. And then there's an absent narrative, which is when you describe a group, but you don't actually talk to anyone from that group when you're describing them. So you might talk about disabled people, but not actually interview a disabled person. You just don't involve them in the narrative at all.
And it's not just about money or lack of. If you don't have a strong family or social network, reliable employment, good health, or quality housing, poverty can become entrenched. It's complicated, and complicated stories are hard to follow. Simple stories are easy to tell and remember, but they don't leave much room for nuance.
Humans have many layers. Layers like your gender, your age, where you live, where you were born. And because they're all part of you, you can be discriminated against on the basis of any of those layers.
The way we talk about disadvantage and who tells the stories can shape and shift negative or inaccurate perceptions and hopefully spark action to address the problems it creates. The heat map is a simple matrix. The groups on top are those presented in public stories or research about disadvantage, like First Nations people, the homeless, those living in poverty. And on the side, the different ways their stories are told, like negatively, misrepresented, or absent. The darker the red, the more that group overlaps with these common public narratives or ways of being represented.
People who are discriminated against for lots of reasons are only represented as one column at a time. What that really means is that many individuals deal with discrimination at multiple levels all at once. And it's important to acknowledge that the map doesn't really represent that individual experience.
We can also change the way we tell stories, and we have, when someone or something prompts us to think about it differently. The Me Too movement, the postal vote on marriage equality. What we used to call underpayment has been hardened into wage theft. The way we explain the world shifts. It might help join up some of the different ways disadvantage shows itself and help us see the bigger picture when it comes to finding solutions. Thanks for watching.